Welcome to the Unapologetically Jewish podcast. My name is Matthew Tobe, the host of the show, and I want to welcome my guest today. It is an incredible freelance journalist. We have Adam Zivo, who is the freelance journalist best known for his column in the National Post. He is joining us today from Ukraine. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we're going to dive right into it. So we want to talk about pretty much everything, but we're going to narrow it down just a little bit this morning to, let's start off with the world that the queer world and how it disassociated from Judaism, and let's start from that one point there, and we'll go from there. So October 7th hit. What happened?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's any surprise to people that the LGBTQ community tends to be more progressive and that far left politics is quite popular, at least in the scene. And when I say the scene, I mean the ecosystem of bars, theaters, NGOs, institutions, advocacy organizations that kind of form public LGBT life. And so we know that on the far left, there has been a historical hostility towards the Jewish community, which we can trace back to the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, when the Soviet Union, in an attempt to curry favor with the Arab states, decided to back this idea of anti-Zionism, which of course was a way for them to attack Jews, but indirectly, right? And so although LGBT people are generally very sensitive to oppression, and they talk a lot about racism, transphobia, biphobia, Islamophobia, every phobia under the sun, when it comes to anti-Semitism, that has never really been on their radar. And I think that was something that was understood to a certain extent within the LGBT community up until recently. And then, of course, after October 7th, it became far more explicit. So I myself am not Jewish. I'm just an ally because, as a child, I understood that water is wet and anti-Semitism is bad. The Pianist was a film that really touched me a lot emotionally, lasting impression. And I never thought that we'd have to relitigate it. But when October 7th happened, I noticed that many of my gay Jewish friends, they were abandoned and they were vilified for trying to speak out against the horrors of Hamas and found themselves being isolated and surrounded by former friends who, for whatever reason, had decided that radical Islamist terrorists are an oppressed population, and I'm talking about Hamas specifically, and need to be vehemently defended.
So it's funny you say that because before October 7th, I was an addiction recovery coach and a lot of support for everybody. And same thing, October 7th hit, and all of a sudden I was a radical amongst people who were all about supporting everybody. And then I became, persona non grata in that world because, I was the oppressed. I pushed people down. And it was an eye opener to that, and it happened across every area. But when it came to the LGBT community, my son who goes to just graduated university, I was talking to their Chabad rabbi. And he said after October 7th, he flung the doors open to his house to a community that wasn't really associated with what he did as a Chabad campus rabbi. But he realized that so many students no longer had a home, that they could feel like they lost their tribe, essentially. And he flung the doors open for the same thing. So it was everywhere. And it was crazy how that happened. So how did you feel that? What did you see when it occurred from your perspective and from the Jews you're friends with? How do they react? What do they do? Like we know from what we've heard here and there, but what did you see from that community?
Well, on my end, because I was often in Ukraine, I didn't witness this firsthand, but I started to
Right.
hear from my close friends who are Jewish and gay that they were being harassed for example, wearing the Star of David at a gay bar, or for trying to provide context to the conflict. And these are people who are not, overly radical, not radical at all, really. For them, they wanted to just point out the fact that there was nuance to this issue. And that even though, for example, they disagree with the Netanyahu government, that obviously Jews have a right to their own state, that Israel should exist, that Hamas is clearly a bad force in this world. And so they were ostracized and faced criticism from drag queens, often got into arguments. One of my good friends kept finding anti-Semitic graffiti in one of his favorite gay bars. And then over time, because of this ostracization, they came together and formed a little group chat of gay Jews in Toronto that I became part of, I guess as an honorary member. as
Right.
kind of like a quasi Jew. And so there were many Jews who I knew there and many who I didn't. And it was interesting how they all seemed to feel besieged.
Hmm.
And I think also they felt really perplexed by the stupidity of the people around them because there were people like all these gays and lesbians and trans people who had very strong opinions about Middle Eastern politics, but evidently had only the flimsiest, like the most
Right.
superficial possible understanding of what was actually going on. And I want to give a bit of context as to why far left politics tends to be popular amongst the LGBT.
Please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, keep in mind that for many people in this community, I mean, it's different now, but in previous generations, you were ostracized, right? And so mainstream values were inaccessible to you because mainstream society was telling you that you did not belong there, right? And so gays and
Mm.
lesbians and trans people created their own parallel society. And that parallel society was often hostile to mainstream values. And then, of
Right.
course, for many of these individuals, if they lose the support of their parents or they're dealing with all of this trauma from being bullied as kids, then they don't always do so well professionally and academically. I mean, there are many gay men who actually use this and use that to propel themselves
Hmm.
professionally. It's known as the velvet rage, but there are many who just flounder and they become economically marginalized. And so they then decide that, look, it's this like there's a problem with the system, which is partially true, but then they
Hmm.
decide the only solution is revolution. And so they advocate for dismantling capitalism. They advocate for communism. They want a complete overhaul of society. And part of the reason why they gravitate to extremism is because they don't have any experience working with institutions because they exist on
Right.
the fringes of society. So they don't actually have any understanding of how society works and how to push for institutional change. And so what they're left with is a utopianism, but they don't really have any way to get there. They don't know what practical politics looks like. And so it becomes this big theater of them marching in the streets about how they want revolution now, right? They get to have all of that stuff, which is emotionally satisfying, but deeply impractical. And then tied up into all of this is an anti Westernism that often infects these political spaces. And so anything which is perceived as pro Western is vilified because it is put on
Hmm.
the side of the quote unquote oppressor. And anything which is anti Western is romanticized. And in the Israeli Palestinian conflict, the Palestinians are seen as anti Western, and therefore they automatically are seen as a force for good. And so that disposes many LGBT people into romanticizing Hamas.
Which is, and first of all, that was very eye opening. I've never even thought of looking at it that way and seeing it that way, where they're going to that side because of the romanticization of what it is. And then we have the argument people brought forward, don't they understand what would happen to that community if they actually went to those regions? Is there an understanding of that? Or is there some sort of a veil of just like, there's no way that's actually going to happen? Or is there a belief they just, again, are suspending that belief so they can still support what they want to support?
I mean, once again, this isn't a homogenous group, so there are different factions
Yeah.
that respond in different ways. So, on the most extreme level, you have people who genuinely conceptualize Palestine as an oasis of queer acceptance. And these are people who have never left Canada, never left their comfortable little echo chambers within the gay village, who have no understanding of Middle Eastern politics. And their beliefs are sometimes enabled by international activists who will go to Palestinian territories and they're openly gay. And they'll say,
Hmm.
look, I was fine. And these activists, of course, ignore the fact that Palestinians are not stupid. And they're aware that if a gay activist comes into your city who supports the Palestinian cause, you should probably tell people to leave them alone. Right.
Right.
Right. So if you're a pro-Palestinian activist, you're not going to get the same treatment as a random LGBT foreigner, let alone an LGBT Palestinian. Right.
Right.
But unfortunately, many LGBT people in the West lack this basic critical thinking. And so they look at these influencers or political writers and think, wow, this must be representative of what life is actually like there. And they ignore the ample documentation showing that it is very difficult to be gay in the West Bank, let alone in Gaza. In Gaza, you're basically dead. In the West
Yeah.
Bank, you maybe survive, but you have to live a life of secrecy because you could.
I was about to say, you're going to be very secreted in what you do. And there might be the people who know might be they're just keeping it hush hush. Like, it's very quiet. So,
Yeah. Well, I want to go to the second group though.
yeah.
There's a second group, and I actually find them reasonable. And they say that, look, we understand that the Palestinians are homophobic and transphobic, but that doesn't mean that they should suffer and that victims don't have to be morally perfect. And I agree with that. On my end, for example, I still support Afghan women. I would like gender apartheid to end in Afghanistan. I think what the Taliban is doing to women there is horrible. And I understand that the overwhelming majority of these Afghan women probably hate homosexuals. But the fact that they hate homosexuals doesn't mean that they deserve to be oppressed. And if
Right.
you believe that Palestinians are oppressed, then the fact that they're homophobic doesn't justify their oppression. Now, what I find though, and I find this faction reasonable, what I find is that in far left politics, there is an inability to understand nuance. And that those on the far left, just like in the far right, I mean, the far right is
Mhm.
also a problem. I don't want to say this is just a one sided thing.
No, it's a two-sided, it's that horseshoe. It's
Right.
that two-sided.
So they view things in black and white. And so because of that, they need their victims to be morally uncomplicated. And so they need the Palestinians to be morally uncomplicated, and they cannot accept the grayness of advocating for a population that, is perceived as oppressed but does some bad things. And so once again, this goes back to parts of the far left just wanting simplicity, even if it doesn't track with reality.
So is there a way, and this is a big question and we're not going to solve the world's problems today. Is there a way to change that conversation? Because, as somebody who advocates, for the Jewish community and have tried those conversations. Now, that being said, I'm not going to argue with somebody on social media that's going to go nowhere, but I have had conversations through DMs or text messaging with people who are part of the what I call the as a Jew, right? They're Jewish, but they're not really supportive and part of that LGBTQ community where we've had conversations where I can almost tell that I've gotten a little bit of information into them, but they're kind of so, stoked they've got to keep the fight. However, I've actually noticed they've toned down their rhetoric, right? In
Mhm.
terms of, what they've done and what their belief is. Is there a way to change this? Is there a way to get in there? And again, the far, far left, the ones who are just revolution now, I don't think we're going to get to
Right.
en
So
masse.
I agree with you that with the extremists, those on the far, far right and those on the far, far left, they're
Yeah.
set in their ways. They demonize people like you and me, and they're not going to listen to us. And it is a waste of our energy to try to convince them when we could be more effectively deploying that energy to target people who are more towards the center, but who have some questions. And what I
Mhm.
would say here is that it's very important to focus on education and to uplift the voices of LGBT Israelis who can testify to their own experiences. Because what
Right.
I find is that there is a lot of disinformation about what it's like to be LGBT in Israel. So supporters of Israel will constantly point out that Israel is an oasis of LGBT acceptance
Mhm.
in the
They've
Middle East.
clearly never been to Tel Aviv if they are saying anything otherwise.
Yeah, like in Tel Aviv is a very gay city. I've gone there a lot. Everyone's gay and beautiful, right? For me
Yeah.
as a gay man, it's there's so much eye candy. Maybe that's unprofessional to say, but journalism, right? Got to study the people. But the thing is that the automatic response that I see again and again and again and again is people will say, "Well, did you know that same-sex marriage is banned in Israel?" And usually they don't listen when I try to explain it, but this is actually what the story is. The story here is, as anyone who is familiar with Israeli politics knows, that marriage is handled by religious authorities in Israel, and
Mhm.
that is a relic of the old Ottoman system, which was developed partially to mediate all of these different religious groups in a tense area, right? So the Ottomans
Yeah.
basically said, look, we're going to give the different religious communities power over marriage, and it's going to not be something that the state is going to do, right? And so Israel inherited that, and they probably should have changed it, but unfortunately, there are some tensions between some of the social conservatives and some of the more
Mhm.
progressive Israelis. But what this means is that you don't have secular marriage and you don't have interfaith marriage. You can get married,
Right.
through an official rabbi, through an official Catholic priest, or through an imam. So even if you're Protestant, you can't get married. If you're interfaith, you can't get married. If you're an atheist, you can't get married in the sense that you can't have your wedding, your marriage
Right.
in Israel. But Israel recognizes weddings conducted everywhere else, right? So if you're an atheist, you can go anywhere else, at any other country, get your marriage license, come back, it's valid. If you're gay, you can go get married anywhere else in the world. come back, your marriage license is valid, and you're treated equally. And in fact, there's a cottage industry where people get married online because in Utah, this is like the crazy story. So Utah has really relaxed marriage laws. I don't know why. I suspect it has something to do with the Mormons, but I've
I
never.
think so, with the 15 wives and the sister wives and the whole thing.
Yeah, who knows? But anyways, what that means is that due to their system, you can actually just go on Zoom and book a wedding, like book a marriage session with a Utah official, and you can do it just like this. And it's actually become a cottage industry that is marketed to people all around the world, but specifically LGBT people. And
Right.
look, this kind of marriage is usually not valid for immigration purposes, which is why my partner and I aren't married right now because he's stuck in
Right.
Ukraine. We could technically get married tomorrow in Utah, but it is still a valid American marriage and it is recognized by the Israeli state. So many gays in Israel will just log into Zoom, get married in Utah in quotation mark, get an
Yeah.
American marriage, and it's all normal. And so you explain that to people and then they say, okay, then it begins to make sense to them. And then I'd like to talk about how in Israeli society, gay parents, whether they're gay men or lesbians,
Mhm.
they are very much recognized as being valid parents, right?
Right.
So in Israel, there is a strong focus on family values in an inclusive way.
Mhm.
Israelis like to have lots of kids. There's the underlying psychological mentality is that they need to make up for the lost population of the Holocaust, which makes
Yeah.
sense. And so gay men and lesbians are not exempt from this responsibility from the Israeli perspective, which is great, right?
Mhm.
It's inclusivity by looking at shared responsibility. And
Right. I
I'm going to
love
give
it.
you an anecdote. When I was in Tel Aviv last year for Pride, and I took a taxi from the airport to my Airbnb, and the guy who was a driver, he was a big, burly man, very working class, built like a bull, the kind of guy where in a different context I might worry about being hate crimed if I spoke too freely.
Right.
And he asked me about my life on the drive there. And he asked if I have a partner. And I say yes. And then he asked, so do you guys have kids? And I was thinking in the back of my head, do I tell him that I'm gay? Because I don't want any trouble. I haven't slept.
Right.
Flew in from Toronto. And I decided, whatever, why not? And I say, no, no, I don't have kids right now. It's a bit difficult because I'm gay. And he gets so flustered and he puts up his hand and he says, that's no excuse. That's no excuse. And he
Yeah, get
says,
a better Jewish answer.
yeah, yeah. And he says, my sister is a lesbian. She has kids. It's normal here. There are all sorts of gays that have kids. You need to have kids. It was the most Israeli experience ever.
Yeah, and it's funny, unless you've been to Israel or you know are close with Israelis, you have no idea what that it's so Israeli actually means, right? And it's such an Israeli thing to do. That's incredible. So I think the biggest thing we have is for all of this conflict, education is the biggest problem, right? People aren't educated. They see, and then we see what we see online and we focus on, the memes of, queers for Palestine, that extreme, and then they relate it to chickens for KFC and all that stuff. Where I think we've made jokes of it, but are we better off not even acknowledging it, or what do you think we should do? Because that's part of the problem. And then how do we support the rest of the community? Number one, the Jewish community who are now being left outside or being pushed out of it, because that's a big problem as well, right? Like we've gone from and I'll tell you myself, every year I used to always post one of those memes like, hey, if your father's not talking to you because you came out, let me know and I'll stand with a sign and I'll give you the hug when you walk by. You know what I mean? Like there was
Mhm.
always that. But now we have a bigger one of like, Jews not wanting to be a part of it, even though they're such a big part of the community or still are just an ostracized part of it. So what do we do?
I mean, it's complicated. So I'm not going to presume to come up with any recommendations on how to get anti-Zionist Jews on side. As someone who is not Jewish, I don't think it's appropriate for me to
Right.
tell any Jewish person what their relationship to Israel should be like. I'm an outsider fundamentally. But what I will say on the whole is going back to the education piece, it's important for us to uplift the voices of LGBT Israeli activists and to bring them into Canada where possible so they can speak to their experiences and to tell their stories. And I'm going to give some context here. So, part of the reason why, okay, one of the many ways that people delegitimize Israel's LGBTQ inclusivity is by saying, oh, this is pinkwashing. The Israeli government uses LGBT rights to distract people from its human rights abuses. That's the narrative on that end. And what is offensive there for many LGBT Israelis is they say we are not puppets of our state. We fought for our rights for decades despite our governments. We struggled, we litigated, we protested, and we fought for these rights. And so when you say that our victory should be dismissed, our cultural and
Mhm.
legal victory should be dismissed because this government now is proud of our accomplishments, then it makes us feel like you don't see us as real people. That is the perspective that I get
Right.
from the Israeli LGBT folk. And they say that they feel as if their agency is being minimized and they are not being seen as full human beings. And I think that that's makes sense. I mean, look, if you imagine any other country where you had LGBT activists who fought very hard for their rights, and you said, well, actually, it's just pinkwashing to for the government to recognize that. I mean, you would say it's inappropriate. You could say, for example, oh, Canada's engaging in pinkwashing by celebrating its LGBT rights records because there are still injustices in that country.
Right.
And so I think it's important for us to bring these activists to spaces in Canada where they can, for example, educate Jewish activists on how to better talk about these things and to give them public platforms where they can maybe connect with wider audiences. On my end, when I was in Israel for the first time in May of 2024, so I stayed a few days extra because I was there as part of the Exogen Foundation, like one
Yeah,
of
I was
their
about to say, yeah.
yeah. I'm part of that secret cabal that, Rachel Gilmore and her friends are really obsessed with. And
Yeah.
yeah, I said, look, can I come a few days early and stay a few days later? Because I want to talk about gay stuff. I want to interview gay Israelis. And I wrote a
Mhm.
story based on interviews with four individuals who gave very different perspectives. And that made quite a splash. And then that pissed off some of the pro Palestinian advocates, which I think is a testament to the efficacy of that story.
Right.
And I even heard, for example, there was this one Israeli drag queen who told me about how Palestinians and Arab Israelis used to do drag sometimes in the 2000s, very secretly. It was a very underground gay scene. But I think it was an interesting angle for understanding intercommunity relations and can show that, hey, actually, look, even in the context of LGBT life, Israelis and Palestinians can coexist.
That's amazing. So how do we support, because again, there's the education component to educate people about the it's not pink washing, it's a safe space. And there are many, the community in Israel and the Jews in general. How do we support, what are your thoughts about how we support the Jews from your conversations with your friends and your WhatsApp groups and all that? Are they still feeling marginalized? Are they still feeling outcast? And how does a community help support that? Because unless you have the conversations and we know, unless you're part of that community or have a relative in the community, we don't know, right? Like, we hear a lot about it, but how do you think the Jewish community and or the secular or the allied community, everybody support that? Because part of the challenge is we don't know. And I hate the phrase, although I say it all the time, we don't know what we don't know, right?
Look, so what I'm going to say is that thoughts and prayers are nice and conversations are nice, but ultimately what matters is concrete organization and deployment of capital, right? And so for many of my gay friends, they can't like there's so much funding for LGBT stories in Canada
Mhm.
because our government really likes that stuff. And so they throw a lot of money into it. Is if you say, "Oh, I'm genderqueer and I feel sad about it sometimes," you can get a grant way more easily. It's actually it's a bit of a joke in the art sector, right? Everyone now is gender nonconforming, non-binary, neurodivergent because it gets money,
Yeah.
right? But if you are LGBT and you want to talk about your experiences as a Jew, then you're probably not going to get that funding because anti-Semitism trumps LGBT inclusivity. So if you want to get those stories out there, you need to find alternative forms of funding. And so this is where I think Jewish organizations can make some strategic investments. On top of that, pride parades are usually very anti-Semitic. I mean, they're
Yes.
quote unquote anti-Zionist, but in practice, it's anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And so I think that one way to challenge that is to, first of all, have the Jewish community organize, pro-Jewish events that are very visible at pride parades. Get together a group of Jewish activists and show up at pride parades. Make sure you wear your Star of David, be very visible, and take up space there. these kinds of tactics worked for progressives in the 2010s. They can be adapted for the
Right.
Jewish community in the 2020s.
And we're not talking amongst a float. We're talking amongst the revelers and the people watching. And
Yeah, I mean, look, for example, we know that Toronto Pride is coming soon.
Mhm.
So, look, if I'm in Ukraine right now and I don't want to like be a leader in this because it's not my place as an outsider, but if I was a gay Jew who was annoyed by all of this, what I would do is get as many gay Jews and non-gay Jewish allies as possible, print out shirts with like the Star of David, get some body cams, and then go and show up and just stand in the middle of the pride parade. Not the parade, sorry, the pride festival, and
Yeah,
talk to people. Set up signs saying, "We're gay, we're Jewish, we wanna talk." Answer their questions,
right.
right? And so that's provocative, and
I
that
love
can
that. Almost like an ask me anything type of table almost at Pride Parade. In fact,
exactly, and then look, some people are gonna be pissed off about that because, I mean, there are going to be anti-Semites there, which is why you need the body cams. Then you record that, and then you send that to people like Warren Kinsella or myself, and suddenly there's some accountability there because there's evidence of the fact that anti-Semitism is at these festivals and that it's not being addressed. And then go and email the head of community engagement and sponsorships at TD Bank at any, like literally go through all of the sponsor lists for these festivals. And if you experience anti Semitism, send them the footage and say, do you condone this? And then when there's sponsor pressure, when sponsors feel like their brand is being harmed,
mhm,
then pride festivals might listen because, of course, for them, they need to make sure that they stay financially solvent, right? So go after the sponsors, show up, take up space, be civil, right? Because the
right.
moment you act like an asshole to other people, you're the bad guy. Don't give them an excuse to vilify you. You need to be, it's like a game, right? You cannot
Mhm.
show your anger. You cannot break and be as polite as possible. Kill them with kindness. And some
Yeah.
people will be brought on side and the anti Semites will look like assholes and then use that.
For somebody who doesn't want to be the poster child of this idea, this is an amazing idea that's been thought of, I'm sure. And the challenge we have here, when they did lose some funding, it was 2 years ago, the city stepped in.
Yeah.
And that was our challenge here, where they didn't lose the funding because the city threw the funding at them as well.
Well, I mean, so here's what you can do is you can go to Olivia Chow and you can say, "Do you condone this?" Right? And you can apply some municipal pressure there. And in other years, that might not work so well, but we are in an election year and Olivia Chow is vulnerable and you can exploit that to your advantage.
Right.
So, for example, on my end, so I'm going to tell you a story about my relationship with Pride Toronto. And I like to talk. Let me know if I'm talking too long, but
Talk away. This is great. This is the whole purpose of this podcast is to get information and education and get the conversation going. The more people that can talk about it, the better. And if we can, listen, we're unapologetically Jewish. If we can get somebody annoyed to start a conversation about it, then we've done our job.
okay, wonderful. I can be kind of annoying, so I appreciate that. So, before I was an evil National Post columnist, before I became a thing, I used to be a gay activist and a fashion photographer, right? Fashion photographer to conservative commentator, it's the natural pipeline.
Okay, it flows so easily. That's just
Yeah, and so I used to do large scale art installations in the late 2000s. I had a campaign called Love is Love is Love. Pride Toronto liked my work, and in 2020, they wanted me to do a big art installation for them, which then fell apart because of COVID. But I maintained that relationship. And so in 2022, when the Ukraine war started and I ended up in Ukraine, I reached out to them and I said, hey, look, I'm going to be in Kiev and Lviv, and I want to do a thing about LGBT Ukrainians. And they said, yeah, sure. And they gave me a small budget, $2,000-3,000, and said, do it. And so I made this
mm,
this kind of mobile fabric mural. It was, like a step and repeat wall that people use, which is
yep.
basically it's like a plastic frame and you put the fabric over it and usually has brands. I use that model to create a big mural featuring Ukrainian LGBT Ukrainians talking about their country, talking about the war. And that was really well received. And so next year, sorry, in 2023,
Yeah.
I was in Serbia because I'm Serbian. And I was like, well, why don't we talk about, LGBT Serbia? And so I reached out to Pride again and they said sure and they gave me money again. And then the following year, I went to Taiwan and I was there during Taipei Pride because the government invited me for another event and it coincided. And I said, look, why don't we do a Taiwanese thing? And they said, sure. And every single year, it was fantastic. I
Mhm.
took up the exact same location, which was on the street. It was part of the street festival. Basically, it would normally be a fence. And every year I had like my murals there and they would email me and they said, "Oh, this was a wonderful exhibit. We really love it. We got such a positive community response." So I knew that they liked me and I knew that they
Right.
liked my work. Flash forward to the end of 2024. And given everything that's happening, I think to myself, well, why don't we talk about, like Jewish Canadians who are gay? I usually do stuff that's abroad. Presumably, they would care about Canadians, right? This is
Right.
this is home who are Jewish. And so I reached out to them. And I want to stress that in the previous years, they had always dealt with this very informally. So I like would message them at like February or March, way after the
Mhm.
regular application. And they would say, yeah, sure, it's fine, right? Their protocols didn't really matter because it didn't seem like they were getting that many submissions, to be honest.
Right.
And I emailed this, I gave them a proposal and I said, look, I'd love to do a thing. And I wanted to make sure that they didn't have any excuse to say no. So I said, look, I will get this fully funded by the Jewish community. So it's not going to cost you anything. So you can't use budget as an excuse this time.
Right.
Right. So they got back to me and they said, oh, first of all, you're late. You missed the application. Second of all, we're not sure if we can find space. And I was like, what do you mean you can't find space? You're an outdoor festival, right?
Yeah. It's all space.
Yeah. Like where there's a will, there's a way. You can fucking find space. Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, these fuckers. Anyways, and then they said, "Oh, well, we want to give more exhibition opportunities to new artists." And I thought, that sounds a bit strange. And so then I got on a call with them and I said, "Look, I'm going to be very blunt. It seems like you're saying no to this because I want to talk about Jews." And they were like, "No, it's not what it seems. We just don't know how much space there's going to be." And then they said, "Oh, and you can just," they said, "But you know what? We'll accept your application after the deadline." So I submitted my application and then it got rejected, even though they loved all of the previous stuff and went on and on and on and on about how great it was. I mean, it's basically the same concept. And then when I thought, okay, this is probably because of the Jewish thing.
Mhm.
And then when they announced their artists for that year, I think like about half of them, more than half, had previously exhibited the previous year. So this whole thing about wanting to exhibit new artists was evidently bullshit.
Right.
And
Of
then
course.
yeah. I was in Ukraine at the time of Pride. So I was, there with my fiance, other part of the world, listen to drones, whatever. But I asked my friend who's gay and Jewish, and I said, "Hey, can you go to where my murals normally were and see if that space is empty?" And so he went and he took a video and the space was empty.
Was empty.
Right. It was just an empty piece of fencing, and just to add more symbolism, there was just some naloxone hanging from the fence, because they don't care about the Jews, but they wanna make sure that the addicts get as much attention as possible.
Exactly.
Right. And so they would rather have Pride Toronto would have rather had a bare piece of concrete and an ugly empty fence than to have a mural that recognized Jewish, LGBT Jewish Canadians talking about the intersection of being gay, lesbian, trans, and Jewish.
Wow, that is not surprising, but at the same time, it's like mind blowing me that you've gone from this to persona non grata to have your stuff there and to leave this. Like you would think they would at least put something in that spot just to save face.
Well, that's the thing. And
Which
then look, and going back to what I said earlier about tactics, like if I wasn't in Ukraine right now, if I was going to be in Pride Toronto, and if I really wanted to make a big deal out of this, I would like probably go to someone and say, hey, do you want to fund a big banner that says Jews belong here? And we can go right to where that empty space is. And we can set that up where the empty space is, where there should have been a mural about, Jewish Canadians. And we just said, well, you know what? You can remove us if you want, but we want to ask, why is the space empty? But then that
wow,
would be
yeah,
making it all about me. And, I make things about me enough already in my life, and I don't want to take up space from the Jewish community.
but it's needed, and your voice is absolutely needed because so many people are scared to have that voice and that's why so many in the Jewish community always, whether as part of the LGBT community or straight community, whatever it is, we keep on looking for the allies. We always want allies to help us because we seem like we're alone and we kind of need that support. So you doing it is so important. From there, so let's go. You went from this artist and now
Yep.
you're in that. We're going to quickly go. How did that roll out to become a National Post columnist from where you were before? Because like I said, the pipeline doesn't generally lead that way.
Mhm. Well, okay. So I benefit from having a wide toolkit of talents. And I've always been precocious and a bit of an overachiever and quite like relatively talented creatively. And I started off as a wannabe filmmaker and had some success there, was like, I was okay. I was a relatively
Mhm.
good photographer, but my talents only went so far. And for university, I did like a philosophy degree. I did an East Asian studies minor, and I was always interested in politics and I was always interested in broadcasting my opinions at people. I get it from my mom.
Okay.
And I ended up leaving that world because I accepted a position as the head photographer of a modeling agency in India. So I moved to Mumbai, and it was something
Wow.
that was coordinated by this Indo-Canadian in Ottawa. And then the whole thing actually had a whole bunch of sex trafficking involved. So I had to flee and go back to Canada. It was like a whole thing. It was really traumatizing at the time. I was really angry about it. I myself was not sex trafficked, but the people around me certainly felt the
Okay.
pressure to be sex trafficked. And then I was like, well, fuck this. I don't want to work in this industry anymore. And so I was trying to
Right.
figure out what to do. And I had thought that I could maybe do law school or public policy. And the problem though is I wrote my LSAT and I totally fucked it up. So I got like a 165 ish, which is like top 10%, but that wasn't what I wanted. And like my practice test had me in the top 1%. And I was like, well, I felt like a failure, but I ended up trying to think, okay, well, I can't afford law school right now, and my LSAT wasn't as good as I wanted, and I
And
ended
it
up,
felt like that.
yeah. So, and I almost didn't do. I did decide to do a public policy master, which I almost didn't do because I wasn't in contact with my parents at the time. I was really broke and I thought, look, I can't afford it. And then at the last moment, I end up walking over to the admin building and applying, and I got in with like a scholarship and stuff. So around this time, I was like doing my LGBT activism. That was doing really well.
Mhm.
I was doing large scale installations in Toronto City Hall, Ottawa City Hall. I got all this media coverage. The CBC did a story about my thing. I was on the radio sometimes, but I realized that the activists who I was engaging with were not exactly that bright and
Right.
they weren't practical. And I believe in social justice, but I believe in practical social justice. And the way that I would put it to them is that you guys are so concerned about raising the roof that you're not thinking about consolidating the floor, and the floor is much flimsier than you think, which turned out to be true because we saw this backlash in
Mhm.
the 2020s. And so I went and did this public policy master's so I could be a policy advocate and could actually understand institutions and more effectively advocate for change. And
Right.
then when I graduated, COVID happened and I was writing essays about LGBT politics from a centrist perspective. And Sean Spear, who was a columnist with
Yeah.
the National Post at the time, he used to be high up in Stephen Harper's government. So he was one of my professors. So I went up to Sean and I said, hey, I emailed him, said, hey, I'm writing about LGBT stuff from a centrist perspective. It's really hard to find people who can do that, who are smart and have community credibility. Can you help me get a larger platform? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Can you introduce me to the National Post? And he did.
Okay.
And then they liked me. And then I became a columnist. And that's how I became what I am today.
It's amazing. And listen, and the National Post, I like it because they take my op-eds. And it's a great resource for learning. I truly believe after really going, I know that all newspapers should be like this, going through submitting things, it's the most truthful we're going to get out there from what I've experienced. If I mean, I've gone back and forth over days with this source and this copy and this link, and it's the what you have to put behind it to just, if I say one little thing, if there's a number involved, I'm showing 15 different sources for that number, which I think is extremely important. I don't think people understand that what goes into what we do, what you do. And when you
Mm.
write an article, how detailed you've got to be and how backed up it has to be. It can't just be statements.
Well, so what I'll say is that I understand that there are many Canadians who have an anti-national opposed bias, and they think that we are some tabloid rag, which I personally disagree with.
Hmm.
As a National Post writer, I think that we do great work, but I have submitted to all sorts of different media publications. I've been published in all sorts of outlets, whether it be the Jerusalem Post, Toronto Sun, whether it be, let's say, for example, Extra Magazine, which was a gay magazine years ago. And what I found is that the National Post has the most stringent requirements for fact checking. And a
Mm.
lot of that goes down to Carson Drema, who's the current head of the opinion section. He's
Yep.
a hard ass on that. He's great with his job. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's by the way, that's an understatement. And he's a hard ass on it. Trust me.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? He's a hard ass, and he makes sure that every sentence, every clause that you have is backed up. He's really stringent on fact checking. And then, of course, Rob Roberts, who's the editor in chief, provides excellent leadership for the newspaper as a whole. And so,
Mhm.
what I would recommend to anyone listening or watching this who might have negative perceptions about the National Post, I mean, like sometimes their headlines are spicy, but you need that in a competitive environment. But if you read the articles, everything has been vigorously fact checked, and we don't just put anything there. And I think we have a lot of great content. And so I would ask some of the more politically progressive listeners of this podcast, if there are any, to give the National Post a shot. We have a lot of great work. We're not the bad caricature that you might think that we are.
That you've been painted, which is not fair. And it's again, I actually did one op-ed and Carson responded to me. Usually they'll highlight what needs to be, can you this and this and this. He just sent the whole article back to me and he said sources.
Yeah.
I'm like, which ones do you want? And it was like all of them. I'm going line by line. Did I get this from anywhere else? And it's amazing. It really is. It shows that they actually have that old school media, journalistic integrity that we have to give the right story out there. You may not like the story you're reading, but you have to know that it's, cross-checked and double-checked 1,000 times. So now we're at the National Post. So you're doing everything that you're doing, and then you're learning so much more. So we talked a bit before about, the psyop of stuff behind the scenes, we talked about what you saw in Israel with the AI stuff. When you're looking at that as a reporter, as a freelance journalist, and you're seeing what's online, what's your first take? Like, because you've been in Israel and you're watching. I know I actually saw the stuff you did about the fake Tel Aviv explosions, and how do we deal with that? Because we as Jews or supporters of Israel in general look at it being like this is ridiculous, but so many people believe it, and we're starting to learn that the psyop is so easily done because people are hating on Israel so much, they'll believe anything. Like,
I unfortunately have a pessimistic view on this issue, which I think is generating disinformation has become so cheap. You can do it at enormous scale that I don't know how we can combat it. And so, to explain what you mentioned earlier about the AI problem, so I was in Israel during the 12-day war last year by accident.
mm,
I was covering Tel Aviv Pride, and then all of a sudden there was war with Iran. And I was there, of course, for this year as well. And that was not by accident. I went intentionally to cover the war.
right.
And in both cases, Tel Aviv was actually pretty much okay. Obviously, there were a few ballistic missile hits here and there,
Mhm.
and they create these spheres of destruction, but 99.9% of the city was fine. But that's not what you see online. And part of that comes down to media reporting, because if you send a war correspondent to a war zone, you're going to look for the stuff that's most dramatic, right?
Right.
So a large publication is not going to have their staff reporter cover the cafes and people jogging and people going
Yeah, they're
on
not
the
going to Tel Aviv Beach watching a normal Sunday morning.
right. They're going to go to the blast sites, and they're going to get the image of the blast site that is very dramatic, because what bleeds leads. And that is part of the story. That is the most important part of the story, of course, because that is what war is. But that is not the
Mhm.
only part of the story. And the fact that someone can walk their dog or drink an iced coffee an hour or two later, that is that is part of war too. But that is not what people are interested in, because it is not sensational. And so I think that people will get confused. They do get confused when they see just the most sensational aspects of war in the media, and they think that that's everything. And so that primes them to accept disinformation. And the same problem was here in Ukraine, right? Ukraine,
Yeah.
obviously, there are horrible things happening all the time, particularly around the front lines. I'm not near the front lines. It's 4 hours east of me. We get bombed in Odessa on a regular basis. We have drones coming in, we have missiles coming in. You hear explosions on occasion, and then you go and you grab a cinnamon bun and you meet some friends on the beach, right? But that's not what's going to make the news. And so,
Right.
for example, my family, they think that I'm in much more danger than I am, because they don't understand. They don't see the same things that I see. And so in Israel, it's the same way. People in Israel were generally much calmer than their family members back home. And they would talk about that. They would talk about how a big part of the war is keeping people calm. And that boils down to dynamics of news. However, this sets a foundation. And then when Iran was unable to defeat Israel in real life, it descended into its own world of hallucination and
Yeah.
ended up, yeah, all of these pro Iranian, anti Israeli accounts created a flood of AI generated photos and videos that claimed to show Tel Aviv being destroyed. And last year, much of it was easy to spot because I mean, this is crazy to say, but AI video was still in its infancy. It's astounding how much can change in a
Yeah.
few
It's
months.
it's it's leaps and bounds now. It's a whole new product.
Yeah. And so this year it was even worse. And then you have people who share disinformation. So some of them will do it because they want to monetize on it, right?
Yeah.
Because now social media platforms, they will compensate people for engagement. So if you're an account that gets lots of clicks, then you're going to make money. The money is not great. For example, on my end, I have 25,000 followers. I get maybe about 2 to 3 million impressions a month. The amount of money I get is like maybe 300 US dollars, a month. It's not a
Yeah.
lot. No.
Yep.
But if you're in Pakistan or if you're in India, that goes a lot farther. And so we saw the rise of third world engagement farmers who would post wartime disinformation because they knew that it would get an enormous amount of clicks and then they would generate money off of this. And so they would say, we're going to show you footage of Tel Aviv being destroyed that no one else wants you to see. And you and I can know that this is false. But for people who want Tel Aviv to be destroyed and they want to get the sense that they're seeing the real deal, they flock to that and then they share it because they
Yeah.
want people to see the secrets that they discovered. And then this predatory scammer will make lots of money. X responded by demonetizing these accounts to the
Yep.
best to the extent that it can. I don't think that Meta has come up with a policy yet. So that was
Yep.
part of it. But then you also have individuals who share this disinformation, I guess because they're grifters.
Yep. There's a lot of grifters out there now about this war.
Yeah. And look, this is a huge problem on the far right. Like we can
Yep.
talk about how traditional mainstream media has its biases, and that's a problem. And in many ways, social media has provided some useful counterbalance to that. But the fact is that social media, you don't have accountability, you don't have editorial standards, you don't have stakeholders to answer to or regulators to answer to as someone who's publishing there. And so you have these right wing grifters. You have like this guy Douglas MacArthur, who is a former
Mhm.
military expert apparently, and he said last year that 1/3 of Tel Aviv had been destroyed. Which, when I saw that, I thought, are you on crack? Like,
Yeah.
did you fall on the concrete as a child? Is there some brain injury? But people listen. So
Yeah.
I don't know how we can fix that because even traditional fact checkers, they were overwhelmed by the disinformation from the last war. And presumably this will only get worse going forward.
And that plays into everything now because we're not looking because that eventually will evolve to not just what we see in a wartime, but everything else that's happening. Like this, creating things. There's a big meme going around of AI of these dogs doing tricks and this and that. Like my wife says to me all the time, I'm like, that's not a real dog, that's AI, right? Like, but I'm at the point now where I question everything.
Mhm.
Like I don't even know at this point. Like I'm like, oh, that's cute. I don't even know if that's real.
Yeah.
Like and that's one side of it. But that's also because I'm immersed in this. I'm looking at this being like, there's no way that's real because I'm seeing it, especially if you see it multiple times in a different angle. But it's the same thing. It's not like it's a different camera angle. But they're trying. It's we have to teach ourselves, teach our kids. I looked at now. The way Wikipedia was taken over, right? My kids, when they were in grade school, they're now in university, were taught by a teacher at the time that Wikipedia is a great source for information.
Mhm.
And I told them that's the last place you're ever allowed to look. And that was like 10, 12, 13 years ago. Right. So I think it's a lot of it has to do with us making sure that we are giving the information and showing people. So when somebody even sends me a video, and I did this a lot during COVID, people would send me an article and I'd read it, but then I'd have to find out, research the other side of the article and be like, no, that's a fake article. Right.
Well,
Which is
it's interesting that
also,
you bring up the whole anti-vax movements, and just to be very clear, I'm pro-vax, I'm pro-lockdown. Maybe some people who listen to this podcast might be angry to hear that. At the same time, I thought that some of the stuff is draconian, but anyways, that's the context here. But I know that during COVID, there were people who developed very strong opinions on public health measures, usually based on short Instagram video,
Hmm.
social media posts with no context, and they became quote unquote experts on this basis. And I see the exact same dynamics with the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is not surprising. I mean, this is a terribly banal observation, but it is still frustrating. So, for
Hmm.
example, I've had friends of mine who I've known for many years, people who are they have great hearts. They make the world about around them a better place to the extent that they can. They're civically minded. They're empathetic. And then they tell me, how can you support Israel? And they'll send me short, alarming videos of 40 seconds, 45 seconds, talking about how evil Israel is. And I've had to tell some of them, like, look, if you care about this issue, you need to understand that it is a very complicated topic. And
Hmm.
if you are politically invested, that creates a responsibility. You have a responsibility to do real research here. You care about the Palestinians, great. Then do your job correctly and educate yourself by actually reading books and in depth articles rather than relying on short form video content. And I don't know if it gets to them because I'm not even denying what they're saying because I don't want to even argue with them at this point because they're not
Right.
ready for it. But I tell them, look, if you care about this, then I am ashamed of the level of research that you're doing because it is not research at all. So I don't know how we can dissuade people from forming strong opinions on such low quality information. I imagine if I had a solution, I'd charge a lot of money as a consultant for,
Right. Yeah.
to governments for it. But I don't know. I kind of think that we're kind of screwed here.
It is. It's hard. So I know that when I've had people reach out to me who aren't Jewish, old colleagues of mine from years ago, who would say to me, they make a comment on a post on mine on Facebook, and I try to make sure